This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
With a federal election due in the first half of next year and interest rates likely to have some influence on the outcome, we thought it might be worth having a look at the number that the Reserve Bank says is a major factor in the decisions that it makes on the interest rate. It's called the trimmed mean, or underlying inflation. We'll look at what it is, why it's important, and why the RBA watches it so closely. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Andrew Williams.
And I'm Alice Dempster.
Alice, the cost of living is a big issue for people at the moment. In many countries around the world, the fact that goods and services are so expensive compared to the wages that people earn has led to changes in government. Experts say, for example, it was a big factor in Donald Trump winning the US election.
And it's no different here. Several polls over the last year, including one from The Guardian last week, have the cost of living as the number one issue amongst Australian voters.
And one of the major factors in cost of living is inflation. Essentially, how much more expensive goods and services have become over time.
Yeah, as an example for that, the Bureau of Stats has a table on its website which shows the rise in things like a movie ticket, which cost $3.30 back in 1973. It now costs $24.50 on average. That's inflation in a nutshell. Things get more expensive over time. And the Bureau of Stats measures inflation based on a cross-section of those sorts of goods and services that give an indication of what a dollar is worth now. It's not as much as 50 years ago.
No, and if wages aren't going up at the same rate, inflation can hit our hip pockets really hard. So every month, the Bureau of Stats releases the monthly inflation rate. It's been around 2 to 3% for the last 2 months, down from a high of 8.4% in late 2022. Now, 2 to 3% is the Reserve Bank's target range. They want it sitting comfortably there before they consider dropping interest rates. The thing here is they haven't dropped them yet because they are taking another number into account.
Yeah, the other number that gets released that measures what's called the underlying inflation rate, that's the trimmed mean. For those that are rusty on their high school maths, a mean is the average of a set of numbers. And why it's called the trimmed mean is because it trims all of the really large price changes that might be due to short-term trends or impacts off the data being measured. For example, the energy subsidies brought in by the Albanese government, or something seasonal like a weather emergency that drives up the price of mangoes.
By cutting off all the fringe outliers from the numbers, the Bureau of Stats is seeking to get a better idea of the underlying rate of inflation. And why that's so important is because that's something the Reserve Bank of Australia looks at when making the decision to cut or raise interest rates. So up next, we'll look at how it affects interest rates and why it's so important to the upcoming Australian election. So one of the tools available to administrators to try and control inflation is cutting or raising interest rates. If inflation is high, central banks like the Reserve Bank of Australia will often raise interest rates to try and get it under control, because by raising interest rates, people have less disposable income, less to spend, and that lowers demand for goods and services, which means things get cheaper.
Yeah, and by the same token, the Reserve Bank will often cut interest rates once inflation is under control. What Governor Michelle Bullock has said is that the Reserve Bank wants to be confident that our inflation rate will be between the 2 to 3% target before they take action on a cut.
And to be confident of that, as we said, they're watching the trimmed mean specifically to make sure that it will stay there, as that cuts out anything volatile on the fringes, gives a better sense of where inflation is heading. At the moment, taking the trimmed mean into account, it's around 3.5%, so not quite where they want it, and that's why they haven't cut.
Yeah, and that's important because it affects how much you'll pay on your mortgage if you have one, and also how much you're paying for groceries, but also because it affects the upcoming election. Put very simply, if the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates, Labor will be pleased, as it's a signal that inflation is under control, whereas it benefits the coalition if there's no cut between now and the election because they can campaign on Labor not being able to get inflation under control.
It's a big topic, and while few people were expecting a cut from the RBA this week, some of the big four banks are expecting it before the election is due to be held in May next year. So that makes the trimmed mean one of Australia's most closely watched stats, and that is our shortcut to the trimmed mean and underlying inflation. Alice, you've got a recommendation for us for this one.
Yes, I do. This is for stats and history nerds mostly. It's a Bureau of Stats explainer on inflation, and seeing how the price of some items has changed so significantly in this is really interesting.
We mentioned movie tickets at the start, but you can also look at things like flour and other basic groceries. It's really interesting to see how things have changed over time. I'll put a link to it in the episode notes. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to share this episode with your mates who want to hear the backstory on the big news stories. And don't forget, if you have an idea for a future Squiz shortcut, we love to hear them and we love to hear from you. So just flick it through to hello@thesquiz.com.au. Until next time.